One of the movement building opportunities and issues, or movement building that happened around a critical issue in our city in the last year, was police carding. We all heard about it. Many of us were engaged in thinking about making change on that and trying to effect change on that. Today we have an incredible panel who were very much at the front lines of organizing and movement building around this issue. We are very excited to have Steve Paikin here to moderate the conversation. It's going to be a free-flowing conversation. And I think we're going to be in good hands with Steve to make that happen. Many of you know him as the anchor of TVO's The Agenda. He's also an author many times over. Most importantly, he is a master of conversation, dialogue, and getting to the bottom of things. And so it's my pleasure to invite Steve and the panel. I'll allow Steve to introduce the panel when they come up here, to take us through a conversation about movement building and how we can do it better. Over to Steve.
Let me just take a minute here. First of all, it's really good to be here, and it's really good to see so many familiar faces, some of whom I've known for a very long time. Sheila Block, I see. Sheila's been a guest on the agenda many times. And Sheena McKinnon I saw earlier, who I've known for 25 years from the time she was working in Bob Ray's office. But you all have to take a back seat to Pat Capone, who, if I didn't recognize her, I'd certainly recognize the hat. And Pat, you know how long we've known each other for now? I mean, you were one of the first people I ever interviewed. And it's probably more than 30 years that we've known each other. And it's so fabulous to see you with your Order of Canada on doing such good work in this area. So well done, Pat. As Elizabeth suggested, we're going to have a bit of a conversation up here, and then it will be your turn. There are mics in the hall, so we'll very much want your questions for our panelists once we get going. But I'm going to get it started here. And Desmond, you're not going to be surprised that I want to start with you, because I'm sure there's not a person in this room who didn't read that piece that you wrote last April for Toronto Life magazine, which I think was just extraordinarily influential in putting, no pun intended, this issue on everybody's agenda. And talking so thoughtfully about what it's like to be, as you put it, in the skin that you're in. What impact do you think that article has had on the state of the debate about this issue in Ontario today?
First, let me say that several years ago, before I was writing columns and getting put on the front of magazines, Matri Foundation was supporting my work and was supporting me as a person. And I cannot thank the Matri Foundation enough for the years of support that you all have provided me. So to Elizabeth and everyone in the Matri team, thank you so much.
Here, here.
I am humbled to say that, yes, I do believe that that article had a really big impact. And that's good and bad for me, because the Toronto Star did an incredible job of going to court for years to get the information that formed the basis of their known to police investigation, which exposed just how dastardly a practice carding was and is. I was surprised that that story and that investigative series didn't get the kind of attention that I thought it deserved. And even though I was also reporting on it for years after that, it just didn't seem real for people. And so I think my story made it real, and I think it happened at a time in my life when I was becoming a little bit better known in media circles. You know, I did a lot of media during the 2014 election campaign. I was on television. So people could relate to the idea that it happened to somebody that they had met, and they thought it was awful. And it shouldn't take that to get people's attention, because unfortunately a lot of people can't get on the cover of Toronto Life magazine unless they have some really cool real estate deals going on. But I think it was important to tell stories. That's what I love doing. And I think that personalizing it and then trying to broaden out the conversation from there has made it very real. But I'm not the first to talk about this issue at all.
Not the first, but a guy who significantly moved the yardsticks, and I'm wondering, who did you get meetings with after that article came out that maybe didn't want to necessarily take a meeting with you before that?
Okay, so I guess I'm going to try and be really honest too. I got a phone call after kind of really going in on John Tory on the radio from John Tory, who said that I want to meet with you.
And he's the mayor at this point.
He was the mayor at that point, and I had taken him to task pretty hard for saying that he recognized that his own children would not be treated the way that black and brown children in Toronto are being treated. And these are his very words. And then he endorsed the practice of carding anyway, even though he recognized that it would not impact people like him the way it was impacting people like myself. He called and asked for a meeting with me, and I accepted that, as did Mark Saunders, who had just become police chief. Within about 10 days, they called me. They had already spoken to each other about the idea that they both wanted to talk to me. And unfortunately, even though they both said they wanted to meet with me off the record, they began going out publicly and saying, you know, I've met with Desmond Cole and we're talking and we're engaging, and it was a real lesson for me in what do you get out of meeting with folks who want your voice and your name and who are powerful, and what did they get out of it? So I gotta say, you know, like, quite frankly, it was good for them to meet with me, and it was good for them to try and tell folks, because I had become a face in this issue, that they were talking to me. They have not responded with action the way that we would like them to. There's still a whole lot of talk from our political leaders and our police leaders.
Sandy, let me follow up with you. How influential do you believe to the work you were doing and are doing was Desmond's article in Toronto Life and the ensuing experience after?
Oh, wow. I think that Desmond's article was absolutely influential, and the articles that you've written since have been influential. And it's interesting. We've spoken at events. We've never actually, strategize together, but it seems like we're always on the same page. It's like Desmond's about to write an article about this, and we're about to have an event about this, some sort of mobilizing session. So I think that the stars somehow aligned with the way that we were organizing in our own separate spaces, and with the talents that we have and the access that we have and the communities that we're embedded in. And I think you being able to put what we were organizing around in mainstream media in such a huge way, in a way that the mainstream media doesn't always listen to some of the most marginalized voices. We have a difficult time sometimes getting out there. I think that it really, really did help a lot with that.
Now, let me get a little tougher with my follow-up to Sukanya, which is Desmond's been candid enough to acknowledge that, yes, he's put this issue on the agenda with that piece in the magazine, but he hasn't seen the kind of actual changes yet that he's going for. So, same question to you. How influential do you think so far it's truly been?
I think Desmond's article has been extremely influential, and it's given, I would say, the gasoline to get that car moving. There are many of us in this community who know that carding is a serious issue and are opposed to that. But now, because of Desmond's article, I believe that there are so many more people who are engaged, who understand what the issue is. And now for us, especially at the CCLA, for us the job is to do what we can, to join everybody else and do what we can to end this horrible practice. And I think, as Alan and Elizabeth said, they talked about a rights-based approach, and that's very much what CCLA takes. I can get into this later, but I just want to say very simply right now that there are a number of constitutional rights that are violated unjustifiably by carding.
So in terms of your work, it was helpful.
Absolutely, it was helpful. One of the ways that we affect change is to engage the public. And Desmond's article did something to engage the public that wasn't done in that way before. There were many of us from many different parts of the community at many different levels, even in the public sector, who were fighting against carding. But when you were able to put a face and a story and to write in that kind of way, I think it touched people all over the country and it got people engaged.
Jamil, what have you seen? What's changed?
Well, I moved back to Toronto from law school about 2.5 years ago, and kind of walked into a community of activists and organizers who've been trying to impact carding for a long time. And I think it was really good to see that when this kind of did break through in a mainstream way, that somebody like Desmond was the person to do it, considering he had been in those trenches for a long time prior. I think the main thing, like my focus is on public engagement and public education, and for that work, a lot of it is connecting the dots between what happens in Canada and what we see in US media. So much of what we understand about race relations and policing come from our consumption of US media. And I think Desmond's work has helped connect those dots where it's a little bit easier. Like when one of my friends in New York sent me Desmond's article, that's when I knew that we had broken through that border a little bit. And for the work that we're doing, and obviously like Sandy with Black Lives Matter, it does need to be, I think, transnational, and this has helped a lot with that. So,
Gordon, what have you seen in terms of groups coming together, making efforts in this area since the article came out?
Well, I think if we look honestly,
And microphone a little closer.
that article was the tipping point. But let's make no mistake, this has been around for 50 years. I mean, if you go back to the work of Wilson Head and Bromley Armstrong in the 70s, the work in the 80s, the work in the 90s, the report of Walter Pittman in 78, Cardinal Carter in the 80s, Stephen Lewis in the 90s, Roy McMurtry and Alvin Curling. So this has heavy lifting behind it. What I think it did because of the readership in Toronto Life, which tends to be an upper middle class audience, was to enrage people who never knew about it before. And so for me personally, I was at George Brown and Tommy Douglas Institute. Desmond was speaking. I did not know Desmond. Desmond knew my son. Everybody knows my son, but I didn't know him. So he spoke, and I got kind of moved by it, and I stood up, time to ask a question. I didn't. I said, we need to really do something about this. And a young student at the end came up to me and said, you said we really need to do something. And I said, yes. He said, so do it. So that night I went home to my wife. We had a little chat. We started to call people over the weekend. Many people in the black leadership community who had endorsed John Tory publicly, who were very upset. And we thought, well, why don't we try and bring some people together and have a press conference and call it Citizens Stand Carding? And so there were 4 cabinet ministers, former cabinet ministers, Alvin Curling, Marianne Chambers, Sunaina Condi, and Roy McMurtry. All were there. 3 former mayors were there. 3 former heads of the United Way, authors, writers, musicians, all came. We had 50 then. 4 days later, we had 7,000. And we just went straight out and said, it's time to end it. It's over. I think the most powerful thing in that press conference, though, was a reporter who turned to the audience. There were maybe 80 people. I'd say about 40 of them were black, 40 white, a few other races, and said, who's been carded? Every black person in the room put their hand up. Not one white person put their hand up. It was over. Harold Brathwaite was there, a friend of mine, the former director of education in Peel, originally from Barbados, former educator, very well known, 75 years of age. I said to him, Harold, have you been carded? He said, 7 times. He said, how about you, Gordon? Never. I think that sort of for this city, and there were people, frankly, we were the elders. Most of us were over 70 were there. It's easy when you're the elders because you don't report to anybody. You can just say what you want. It's kind of nice to do that. But some stepped up to the plate who weren't that. Sheldon Levy, the president of Ryerson, said, count me in. Merrick Gertler, U of T, didn't go to his board, didn't go to the faculty association, just said, count me in. Sarah Diamond. A number of people stood up and were counted at an important, courageous point in time. And the mayor got the message. He actually got the message because I think Neil Price's article got it right. It was the establishment speaking to the establishment.
In which case, given the wonderful enthusiasm of the example you just provided, Sandy, you've won, right? Game over. Victory has been achieved.
No.
Right?
No. I was really dismayed to see the front cover of the Star the day after the regulations came out, because I was like, oh my God, everyone's calling me. Carding has ended. I sit on the University of Toronto's Governing Council, so I was in this meeting at Governing Council, and I kept getting these calls, and I kept being like, I have to leave. And everyone was calling me and saying that we won, carding is over. And I was like, no, things don't ever happen like that. I'm not going to trust this so much. And I went through and in the middle of this meeting just started reading the regulation, and I became horrified, and then was even more horrified to see how it was being reported as the end of carding, because the regulations that have come forward, I think what's important to acknowledge, though, is the power in what has happened over the last few months and the last year has convinced everyone that we need to do something, and that it needs to look like the end of carding. So that is powerful in some ways. It means that, but what now my job is to do is to make sure that other people know that what is on the table, the regulation, is not actually the end of carding. There are far too many exceptions included in there that will not make any sort of substantive change with respect to the experience of Black folks with police in this city, and then even more across the province with respect to Black folks and Indigenous people. The regulations, in my view, are more of a how-to manual of how to card than an end to the practice, and that makes me very, very nervous.
Jamil, would you agree that this isn't an end to carding, it's just meant to look like an end to carding?
Yeah, I think carding's had about a dozen different definitions, so it's tough to figure out what exactly is being ended. I mean, so over the last 45 days since the regulation came out, some of the students in my class, we've hosted 3 community consultations across the city about this draft regulation in Scarborough and North York, downtown. And what we found is that there are ideas in there that I think people respond really positively to. In particular, telling people whether they have the right to walk away and not engage with the police, and also whether they need to be given a receipt once they do interact with the police. Those are 2 ideas that people respond to positively. So if those 2 ideas being introduced means that carding is over, then maybe it is. But if ending carding means more than just that, then it isn't, right? And I think that's what we need to be clear on, is what are we defining the end of carding to be? I think from what we've heard from people, despite there being good ideas in there, there's still, as I think Sandy put, some concern over the discretion that officers have, right? And so you can have a lot of good ideas in a policy, but if the application of those ideas depends on the decision making that an officer has, and an officer's instincts or their willingness to apply those rules, then it's unclear exactly when those rules are in effect and when they're not. And that's, I think, the gray area that we've seen people in the community are concerned about since these regulations came out. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we need to be conscious of, I think, what the limits of law and policy can be sometimes in this area. So the lawyer in me hates the idea that law might not be able to solve a problem, but there's a lot of this is behavioral, right? And a lot of it is, and I think Desmond wrote an article about this as well after the regulation came out, there are cultural changes that need to happen. There are behavioral changes that need to happen. There's a level of accountability that needs to occur that I'm not sure a law or policy can affect. And that's where our leadership in the city come to play, right? And so the 45-day review period for this regulation ends on Saturday. So whatever this regulation is on Saturday is what's going to be in effect from the province. But then the city in Toronto and all the city police services across Ontario have until July to create municipal policy and procedure to interpret this regulation in the city context. And so there's more changes that can happen, and I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind, is that the province is introducing a framework, but the work doesn't stop with that. And there's a lot of work that's going to need to be done to make sure that the Police Services Board's policy is interpreting that regulation in a way that we are happy with, and also that the police service itself creates a procedure that we're happy with.
Desmond, what's your understanding of how close to victory you think you are right now?
So two things. The first is I want to use a couple of examples of very well-publicized things that we've seen in the media recently. One is the killing of Sammy Yatim at the hands of Officer James Forcillo, and the other is the arrest of a man named Andrew Berger for obstruction of justice because he saw what he believed to be a police officer beating a man outside of a liquor store and intervened to shield that man and pull him away from the officer, and he was charged with obstruction of justice. The public reaction in both of these cases, a large part of the public reaction has been that there is no preemptive remedy to bad policing. If bad policing happens, all we can do as society is stand there captive and watch. There's no way to stop Sami Yatim from being shot at 9 times and to have 8 of those bullets enter his body. We can only have a court case after that to try and sort out what happened, but Sami is gone. There is no situation in which a civilian who believes that a police officer is beating someone can intervene. They can only watch and witness in horror and then have to hope that there's some fair process after the fact. Doesn't take away the beating, doesn't take away the trauma. So I totally agree with what Jamil just said in terms of the fact that there's cultural and behavioral issues here that go well beyond any law. I would be thrilled if I thought we could make a law that could get us there. We can't. We have to change the entire culture of policing. We have to change the idea that people need to be so policed in the way that they are, that we need to have so many officers on the street with so many weapons on their belt. This is a really, really long struggle, and what I think carding is like a really specific and ugly manifestation of a huge problem about racial profiling, which I use the term because people are familiar with racial profiling, but I just call it racist policing, because there is no legitimate way to profile people based on race. Okay? But it's a huge manifestation of racial profiling and of just of police brutality. And so we have to keep our eye, I think, on those bigger issues, even as we try to get a stronger set of regulations for carding.
So Kenya, in your view, the new provincial regulation, how close to victory does that get?
In my view, they fall very short. There's a couple of things I want to say. First of all, we're completely opposed to carding. I agree with Desmond. It is racist policing. It's not allowed. One of the problems that we have is you have this unlawful, unconstitutional practice that's being dressed up, and the regulations are talking about really when is this allowed, which is kind of what Sandy said. The whole thing is wrong. The whole approach is wrong. You can't pull people over because of the color of their skin. You cannot do this. This is never allowed. And so we've been working on good policing, police accountability across the nation for years, in this province for years. Recently, when I met with somebody high up in the government who I think is very well intentioned, but when the conversation turned to, well, when is carding allowed? And I'm like, it's never allowed. The only time you should be able to pull someone aside is when you have a reasonable suspicion that this person has either committed a crime, knows about a crime, or is about to commit a crime. And that has nothing to do with the color of a person's skin. And there are so many, there's just so many integrated rights violations that occur when you have carding. First of all, you have the right to equality, which is violated. You have the right to be free from arbitrary detention, which is violated. Your life, liberty, and security of the person rights are violated, and your privacy rights are violated, because this information is taken and stored, and God knows who's accessing it and what it's used for. So all of these rights are violated. We've also found that the police are not telling people when they pull them aside. They claim that this is voluntary. Well, it's not voluntary. If you're not telling people, they have the right to walk away, or if you're telling them, they have the right to walk away after you've taken all their information. And they're not providing receipts about it. But the receipt issue is important, but for me, it's secondary to the big issue, which is that carding is illegal and it's unjustifiable. And I also want to say that I very much agree with the mindset and the cultural issues. We've worked a lot on this as well. The motto of police services at least in English-speaking countries around the world, is to protect and to serve. That's completely forgotten. There's an us and them mentality which has to be looked at. We've called for this to be entrenched in police training from day one, including police screening. You can screen for racist beliefs. We've also called for this in terms of how people the police treat people with disabilities or developmental delays, etc. But there's a way to treat individuals, and I think training and role playing is very important, but there is no justification for pulling people aside because of the color of their skin. And when we hear excuses like, well, it helps us with policing, I'm sorry, like, that's just ridiculous. It helps me to drive 200 kilometers an hour to work. I'll get there on time. It's not done. But that's not a good analogy, because when you're talking about looking for justifications for racism, you are not only harming individual lives and communities, but you're completely tearing the fabric of this country. And I do believe in using the law. I think it's not the only thing, but I do believe in it. And the law that I would use is the paramount law of this nation, which is the Charter.
Gordon, let me get your reaction to something that caught a lot of people's attention. The province came out with its announcement that it wanted to end, review, put a new regulation in place, and so on. Many big city mayors have come out against it. The police chief in Peel said, we don't really care what they're going to do. We need to do it, and we're going to keep doing it. What was your reaction when you heard that?
Defeat that police chief. I think take that in its larger sense is, since the draft regulations have come out, the police chiefs as a group have spoken, and they have spoken in a way that the groups up here don't speak. So it is now in the minister's hands, Minister Nakvi. One of the interesting things that grew out on the groups here is most of us worked together to put in a joint brief to the minister, met with him last week, and said, you can't make everybody happy. You know, you are going to have to make a choice, and your government. Now, what is interesting is all the politicians in the provincial legislature agreed to end carding from all three parties. That, to me, was a good sign. What we learned when we had a press conference on Monday of a variety of groups, civil rights, human rights groups together, that Desmond chaired, Michael Thompson hosted, the media came, but it wasn't reported. Last time it was reported big time. This time it wasn't reported. Because it's in the details of this clause and that clause, that's very hard for the media to wrap their hand around, or the government. So I think the police chief in Peel can say what he wants to say, but the politicians in Peel aren't saying that same thing. The issue in the end will be is whatever the province comes down to get implemented locally. Last time, the Police Service Board in Toronto had a policy in 2014 that the police chief, Bill Blair, would not implement. He refused to implement it. Well, that's grounds for dismissal. Frankly, didn't happen. So, to me, this will be province down to the Police Services Board to the police chief on implementation, and in the end, it is behavior. So we got a long way to go.
You mentioned media coverage in that, and Sandy, I want to follow up with you on that. Toronto Life, obviously, a significant role in putting this issue on the agenda. But since then, in your view, how urgently have the media grasped this issue and tried to cover it properly? And maybe a word on social media as well. What influence have those two had in trying to move the yardsticks along?
Well, I mean, thank God for social media, because that allows us to impact the conversation in a way that mass media, if mass media isn't necessarily getting it, we're able to switch things around a little bit. And I do think that the mass media, most media reported that carding had ended and haven't really followed up since then, since the announcement was made. And that has been really difficult for us. We we've been trying to kind of interject and make inroads with events and articles written and so on, but it's difficult. Like you said, it's about details at this point, and it seems like mass media have decided that this is a dead story at this point, or that it's over, it's the end, it's been successful. And I think that part of the problem with that is maybe a strategic error that some of us made, I'm not sure, but I think, and this goes to the behavioral issue as well, this problem that we're trying to address isn't just the problem of carding. What we're trying to address is the issue of anti-Black racism and racism in policing. And if we were to address it in that way, to come at it from that perspective, instead of trying to end a specific practice, we would have to look at all sorts of different things that are embedded in the culture of policing, including ramifications, like what happens at the SIU level, what happens at the Independent Police Review Board. We need to have conversations about that stuff as well. And if that was a part of the whole story, and I'm hoping that somehow we can shift it and include all of these different elements in the story, then I think it would be more obvious that this could never be the end, even if we had just this one regulation, that this could never be the end of the story.
Well, Desmond, maybe you can allay my suspicions here. Your most recent column in the Toronto Star was about Uber and taxis, which is a long way from the discussion we're having here this morning.
Not quite.
Well, okay. Yes and no. You're right. No, fair point. Yes and no. Fair point. Yes and no. But I did wonder when I saw that whether or not somebody in the editorial department of the Toronto Star said, Desmond, can you give the carding issue a rest for a little while and write about something else? Did you get that?
That's a really good question. Absolutely not. I started writing here and there for the Toronto Star over the summer when I had things to say about carding that I wanted to get the largest possible audience for. And based on that, they asked me if I'd like to come on a regular basis. The Toronto Star has never, ever tried to influence what I want to write about. They're very, very supportive.
So you tell them, you say, this is what I want to write about in there, and they say, okay?
I'm the boss, man. But you know, Sandy's really right about the complexity of trying to get to where we are right now in the media. Like, if the media wanted to dedicate resources to this and to keep following up and to keep following up and to using personal stories to explain why some of this stuff is so slippery and so insidious, they could do that. I guess it's not their inclination, and I think it's especially not the inclination of our Canadian media to talk about race in the ways that we need to examine race in order to make people understand the stories. Let me just...
So what do you think's going on? Why do you think they've dropped the ball?
I think it's a good news story to say that journalism worked. To say that this guy told a great story and used some good information and did some good research, and then truth and enlightenment and the facts prevailed. That's not what happened at all. But it's a nice story, isn't it? When we get to talking about deeper things, though, we see how complicated this is. So, for example, the police say, well, we don't by any means countenance racial profiling. We don't tell our officers to go around and stop people based on race. Of course you don't. You don't need to. The whole society already knows that there's a target on our backs. So you don't need to go out and explicitly tell people, hey, could you please stop some black folks? And by the way, anti-blackness and anti-black racism and why do Black Lives Matter? Why do you, Sandy, like, you guys are amazing. Can I just say that? Like, what you guys are doing. I'm so grateful for the work that Black Lives Matter Toronto has been doing and the way that you guys are pushing that other people are not. Why do we take up this rallying cry? It is because, in part, even though no one goes out and explicitly says, hey, target black people, when the police are forced to describe why they must keep this practice, what do they say? They say, well, we have to go into the areas where crime happens, where we're called to go to look at crime. Just happens that that's where all the black people live. Now, they don't add that last part, I did, but That's what they're saying. We have to target gangs. Well, which gangs are you talking about? The Hells Angels? No, that's not what you're talking about. You're not talking about carding Hells Angels. You're talking about carding guys who are 17, who have a bandana hanging out their back pocket, who look like me. So every justification of why society will crumble if we don't have carding points at blackness without ever naming it. This is the insidiousness of anti-black racism that I maybe just explained to you guys, but I think about this stuff every day, and columnists for other newspapers and journalists for other newspapers are terrified to use the language that I'm using on this stage because they don't think that they have the right to, or they don't have the education to be comfortable doing so. And that's part of the reason why the media has problems getting into the really deep stuff of this.
Jamil, do you have a view on why the media appears to have dropped this story in a way that certainly wasn't the case earlier?
Yeah, so I think part of what I hope we think about is that not just like in the media, but activists and people who are public facing in this work in any way, that we are in effect through our work creating a bit of a cultural phenomenon, right? Or at least continuing one. So I was like 4 years old when Rodney King got beat up in LA. And that, like, I remember that when I was a kid, right? I remember when I was a kid, like, seeing my father stopped by the police, or the fact that there were, like, no men in my neighborhood older than 18, and those who, you know, so we were constantly just seeing every male who looked like us constantly being stopped by the police. There is an effect that this has. And when I think about, like, the kids that I see in my work now every day, and every time they go on Facebook or Twitter, they see, like, a kid who looks like them getting shot in a city in America, or they see stories about carding happening here. There's an effect that this has, like, on our psychology, right? There's a trauma in all this media coverage, in the stories that we tell. And I'm not saying that these stories and that the media doesn't have an important role to play, but I think we all need to take responsibility for what we're putting out there and stay committed enough to actually try to solve these problems as we move forward, right? So when we're telling these stories because we want to get the public to understand the issues, and we're telling these stories because we want to change laws and policies, there also comes a burden that we carry to try to bring these things together and create some kind of response to the trauma that gets created through all of this, right? And I think that's a part that the media doesn't necessarily think about, which is, like, what's your responsibility to these issues so that you're telling the story over and over again and sticking with it and making a long-term commitment so that people see some resolution at the end of the day, right? And that people feel like the trauma that they've gone through every time they open up your newspaper or turn on your TV show is being dealt with, right? Like, I live and work in Jane and Finch, and I know we got Success Beyond Limits here, shout out, also from Jane and Finch. And so, you know, this is a neighborhood that has experienced, like, tons of carding, and I see kids every day where their perceptions of how they fit into our city, how they should experience the world, are so much created by what they see with the police and how they imagine their expectations for the police. And so if we go and put that all out there and then just say, all right, now you guys go deal with it, like, you live with that, you grow with that. You know, we have a responsibility to deal with it. So when I think about the role of the media, I think part of it is not just making sure that people understand the problem and not just taking, like, the quick opportunities to promote a solution, like as Desmond was describing, but also making sure that we stick with it so that there is, like, a vision for our city that we're covering, right? Like, we're telling stories about where we're trying to go in the long term, 10 years, 20 years from now. And I think the media's got to be committed to following through on how we tell those stories, not just kind of sticking with carding for a year because it caught a bunch of good headlines, you know?
Gotcha. Round of applause. Let me put one more issue on the table, and then we'll get this audience involved. We heard Alan Broadbent in his opening remarks talk about the challenge of many disparate groups from different parts of the community all trying to get to the same finish line, but occasionally it gets problematic in trying to do that. Gordon, let me start with you on this. We've had a number of different community groups try to row together, if you like, in order to get to the finish line in this. How challenging has it been to organize groups from different parts of the community, different parts of the world, to row together?
We need Bastille Stormers in any kind of change. Sometimes the tactics of Bastille Stormers upset people. I think that was Desmond's article today. But without the Bastille storming, nothing will ever happen. So let's start from there. It seems to me, in bringing people together around common cause of this issue, The only media that has treated it seriously in the last 30 years is the Toronto Star. And they have, and we credit them for it. In moving the next step, the group that sort of signed on within 12 hours, 7,000 people on social media, and they all had a story to tell. What seemed to happen, and I speak as this from what I'd call the elders, I got a call from a man by the name of David McCamus. He's 84. He was the president of Xerox. When Bishop Tutu came in 1986 to Toronto for an Arts Against Apartheid festival, no one in the corporate community would support that. The United Way was doing it. David McCamus went against everybody and said he had worked on the south side of Chicago, we have to stand up and be counted. He and Denham Jolly of great fame and Flow Radio, are both in their mid-80s. At that event they came to, they hugged each other and said, we're in common cause. That to me is powerful. But the issue now is when you get into the detail kind of stuff of behavior, it's very hard stuff. And it's why I think Bastille Stormers, I actually got on social media saying, Cressy, you weren't up there to close down the Allen Expressway with us. Why not? And I sort of, now I don't know social media, but my son said, you have to respond to this, Dad. So I said, when I was 20, that's where I was. I'm 72, this is where I am now. I mean, think of 3 leaders in the black community who passed away in the last 3 years. Dudley Laws, Blacks Action Defense Committee. Charlie Roach, long activist from Trinidad, and Lincoln Alexander. 3 very different people playing very different roles, but in combination, there was an extraordinary power. So I think that is that spectrum, how we pull that spectrum together on this cause to say it's over. What I do believe, you've got the white upper middle class community enraged for the first time. They never understood it. I don't think they really did. They didn't think about it. When people raise white privilege and people say, oh, it doesn't exist, they don't know what they're talking about, right? But people are getting through. So I think it's the responsibility of all of us. In the press conference on Monday, the line I said to Minister Nakvi in the end is, we're not going away. Get that, we're not going away. So I do believe tenacity will have a role in carrying the day here.
You use the expression storm the Bastille. So Sukanya, what in this case constitutes storming the Bastille?
You have no idea what you're asking me because I have a lot to say about the Bastille. But I think for me, I think what I would have to say though on this particular point is that first of all, like it's kind of like the elephant that wore no, I'm mixing up my metaphors, but it's like the emperor who wore no clothes. I do think there are good intentions here. I also think there are negative intentions here. I think that what CCLA is doing, what everybody has a role to play. We have the utmost respect for everyone on this stage in terms of what they have done. Everyone has a role to play. Our role has been to analyze laws, and our role has been about government action. Going back to what Elizabeth and Alan said, for us, basic rights, the rights that I mentioned, like liberty, security of the person, the right to be free from arbitrary detention, these rights inhere in the human person. Like, it's our birthright. It's not something the state deigns to give to us. So I'm starting to get towards the Bastille. It's not something that we have to ask the state for. They have a duty to make sure that we have these rights. And so that duty can manifest by they either stay out of the way and let us have those rights, they protect our rights, or they ensure they do nothing to harm those rights. Well, unfortunately, on this issue of carding, they haven't done any of those things. So our role, what we bring to the table, what we hope to contribute, is to support the work of the people who got their sleeves rolled up and are in the streets doing the work. And what we have done is we have really scrutinized this regulation and pointed out what all the shortcomings are. And we've worked with other groups. My colleague at CCLA, Noah Mendelson-Vive, has been attending these things when, I couldn't attend, but it doesn't matter. We're all we're a team, and we're very committed to this issue. And so I think in terms of storming the Bastille, I think somebody just needs to go in, and that's exactly what this network of groups have done. This regulation has passed. Had it not been for this network, had it not been for these brave people who are speaking out and in the streets, people might believe that the groups that you're talking about, the upper white middle class, might believe, okay, we've dealt with carding. And this network has said, no, you have not dealt with carding. In fact, you might even make it worse.
Sandy, let me give you the last word on this part before we go to questions here. How challenging is it to get all the disparate groups who are involved in this issue and want to see progress all rowing in the same direction?
I think I think, you know, we're not even quite there yet. Like it is going to be challenging. It's going to continue to be challenging, especially as we get more and more into the details. But from my perspective, like I said, we're working on a platform of against racism in policing and in the way that we interact with law enforcement writ large, like the whole thing. And so what I would say is for everyone who's working together on this project, what we need to realize is that it can never be over until the people who are being affected by it say, yes, that's what it looks like, it's over. And that's what we need to make sure that we are paying attention to at the end of the day. And even if this regulation passes or is amended to look like what some groups maybe want it to look like, or some individuals want it to look like, that's not going to be over yet either. It will be irresponsible for us to leave the issue at that moment. We need to continue to work on how racism impacts the Black community, other racialized communities, through however carding will or won't continue, and the rest of policing altogether.